Hello and welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out in the direction of Robotyne, where here we see that the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks in all directions. They advance to the south of Robotyne, to the east of it towards Verbove, and in the direction of the main line of defense, expanding the front line in between the Ukrainian and Russian positions along the anti-tank ditch here by the front line. The Ukrainian forces are here trying to expand their zone of control, allowing them to have a larger buffer zone to send their troops across, try to avoid as much direct fire as possible when they conduct a assault on Verbove. So far, the Ukrainian main general offensive has started. If you take a look throughout the front, all the way from the Zaporizhia front and up to Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces are constantly attacking the Russian positions, and there has been heavy increase in fighting compared to the past few months. So this is where we're seeing the main force of the Ukrainian offensive being pushed on the Russian defenses. And this is all in an attempt to break through the Russian defenses. So what we're seeing is that the Ukrainian forces are now pouring everything they have in an attempt to gain some sort of victory before the final days of the offensive. And that is whenever the rainy season begins, because if we take a look at the weather forecast for Zaporizhia, we can see that the forecast claims for the next 10 days there will only be about 2 days with rain. The rest will be sunny and cloudy. So for the next actually to 26th of September, so next 14 days, it doesn't seem like the rainy season actually begins, and as such there will be no heavy muds across the front line and the Ukrainian offensive can continue. Until the ground becomes muddy, that is when there will be a huge disadvantage to whoever wants to move through these fields, as the weather will start becoming muddy, and as such the vehicles will start getting stuck. So the Ukrainian forces are here trying to take advantage of the last few weeks of the offensive as they try to gain some sort of victory prior to the rainy season and the muddy season beginning. As for territorial changes, there has been none over the past 24 hours. The Ukrainians are still fighting here in the southern parts of Robotyne. There's not a lot of pushing to the western parts because Russian fortifications here are too much for the Ukrainians to just have as a side mission. They have to push through the central part through to Verbove and Novoprokopivka, as that is where the brunt of their forces are located. Moving on to the Vremelsky Lech area and the subsequent Ugledar section, we see that the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks in this direction as well, both in the direction of Novomayorsk. As was reported in my last video, the Ukrainian forces have managed to enter the village. However, there's no reports of any foothold attained, so the Ukrainians were likely pushed out of it, as over the past 24 hours there's been no update on Ukrainian positions within Novomayorsk. As for the western parts, the fighting continues, and the Ukrainians managed to advance slightly in this section, as well as in the direction of Novodonetsk. And as I've said, the Ukrainian forces are here looking to cut off the supply routes here to the south of Novodonetsk, reaching the road, cutting it off, and then moving to capture Novodonetsk. So what we saw is that the Ukrainian forces started a push in that direction, but the Russian forces were expecting it and pushed back, allowing them to hold on to the road, and the fighting is ongoing in this direction as the Ukrainians try to cut off the road and the Russians counterattack to prevent them from doing so. So what does the fighting in this section of the front actually mean on a grander scheme? So what we see is that there are three main villages being attacked in this direction. There's the village of Shevchenkove, the village of Novomayorsk, and the village of Novodonetsk. So these three villages are frontline villages. They have been on the front line since the start of the offensive, and we see that there are subsequently 2 Ukrainian villages to the north of these positions. So, and then there's the river line here to the south of them. So the Ukrainian forces are here trying to cross the river line, which is the initial part of the Russian positions. With the advances conducted in the Vremelsky Lech area, the Ukrainians are now able to advance through the river line to the west and then push onwards to Novodonetsk, which is why we're seeing that as the main target. However, the Russian forces have actually largely left Novodonetsk ever since the initial push at the start of the offensive, where the Ukrainians managed to capture it. Then the Russians pushed back, counterattacked, recapturing the village. Since then, there have been positions in Novodonetsk on the Russian side. However, they are largely left unattended. There's not a lot of them. They have a few fortified positions in the northern edges of the village, as well as by Novomayorsk and Shevchenkova, as they try to prevent a Ukrainian crossing of the river line. Other than that, their main force are south in the direction of Kremenchuk, as well as Yevhenivka, as they are rapidly responding to any Ukrainian attacks in the direction. So what we see is that, for example, in Novomayorsk, where the Ukrainians managed to enter the village, the Russians then responded by sending reinforcements to that direction. The same with the attacks in Shevchenkova, but the Ukrainians are aware of that. This is why they attacked in Shevchenkova first. After that, they then launched attacks in Novomayorsk. So when the Russians sent their reinforcements to Shevchenkova, they then allowed the Ukrainians to get a entrance into the village of Novomayorsk. However, the Russians most likely had enough reinforcements to then send them there and then push them back, which is why we're seeing that the Ukrainians have not managed to obtain a foothold within the village. The reason the Ukrainians are also attacking these villages at the same time as Novodonetsk, instead of just forcing their way through Novodonetsk and then pushing onwards, is because if they manage to capture Novomayorsk or Shevchenkova by a river crossing, they'll be able to flank not just Novodonetsk, but also in the direction of Kremenchuk. The reason for this is that the Russian forces have forward positions to the northwest of Kremenchuk, where here the Ukrainian forces are also pressuring them, but this is actually a position that is fortified and the Russian forces are holding it, which allows them to then put pressure on Robotyne and prevent a further advance in this direction. So the Ukrainians are looking to capture this part. So the Russian forces are focusing on sending reinforcements to this part, which in turn weakens Kremenchuk and Novodonetsk. So with the Ukrainians putting pressure across the whole area, in between Shevchenkova and all the way down to Robotyne, the Russian forces are also being forced to spread out so that they are able to withstand the pressure on all sides. But the Ukrainians then focus their forces in one direction, which for example would be in Novomayorsk, where they then manage to gain a foothold. And if they manage to capture the village, then they're able to put pressure, heavy pressure in the center, and as such attack wherever there is weakness, because they can attack in any direction from Novomayorsk. And this is why we see them try to get a foothold in that direction rather than anywhere else. So this plan actually sounds good on paper, so why hasn't it succeeded so far? The likely reason is that on this part of the front line, the Russian forces actually outnumber the Ukrainian forces. So unlike the Bakhmut front or the Siversk front, this area the Russians have more troops and soldiers and equipment and ammunition and so on than the Ukrainian forces, and the Russian forces are on the defensive. This is why we see the Ukrainians struggling. So unless the Ukrainians send reinforcements to this part so that they're able to match or even outnumber the Russian forces, I have a hard time thinking that this could lead to any success. But we have seen that in the western parts by Robotyne, the Ukrainian forces have managed to capture village after village. So this means that they, with their tactics of rapidly redeploying, could lead to local advantages in numerical gatherings of the Ukrainian forces. As such, we may see that the Ukrainians are able to focus their forces in one spot, like in Novomayorsk, using this tactic, and then outmaneuver the Russian forces. But we'll have to see based on what actually happens on the front. Before we end off, there is this tweet here by Richard Woodruff. He is a British Cossack volunteer in Ukraine since June 2022, so for a little over a year now. And he tweeted this yesterday. Hey all, I want to keep this brief. I thought for a while if I should tell you, but think you deserve to know. We have lost a lot of very close friends these past few days. I know I'm always trying to keep it lighthearted and cheery, but yeah, this war isn't going well. And this is an extension of what we're seeing from basically everywhere. We see that the Russian forces are heavily attacking any Ukrainian attempts at advances. So we know that these advances always come at a cost, as the Russian forces are heavily deploying the artillery, the air force, and so on the Ukrainian positions. So with a constant grind and drain of Ukrainian forces over a 3-month period, that subsequently results in a lot of losses for the Ukrainian forces. You can always claim, well, Russia is also taking losses. Definitely they are. But when someone is on the offensive in an open field and the opponent side has large minefields and heavy artillery and air force, air superiority, all of these things, the favor is clearly on one side over the other, and as such, there's subsequently more casualties on one side over the other. So what we're seeing is that this heavy fighting is taking a heavy toll on the Ukrainian forces, including the foreign volunteers, as is written here. This is, of course, just one out of many, but it is important to take this anecdote nonetheless, as with every passing man who says this, we've first seen the articles, we've seen the Ukrainian soldiers, we've seen now foreign volunteers all saying there's a lot of casualties being taken. This is a very heavy fight. And the general situation is just that the fighting goes on for over 3 months. Not a lot of territory has been taken. But what is very clear is that these Russian defenses are not impenetrable, but definitely a very tough task to overcome. And the Russians are rapidly adapting to the situation as it develops, just like the Ukrainians are. But when you are on the defensive, you just have the advantage. And to just talk about the extent of the casualties very slightly. So I know I'd hate to talk about this because there's no reliable sources, but to put into perspective, the Russian side, which of course would exaggerate the amount of Ukrainian losses, but they claimed for February, during the Battle of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian side across the whole front took about 11,000 casualties. And in comparison, they now claim that through the Ukrainian offensive, the Ukrainians have received 71,000 losses. So this is 7 times as much, but over a 3-month period. If you divide it by 3, you get over 20,000. So this is more than double the casualties than during the Battle of Bakhmut. So this is a significantly higher rate than the Battle of Bakhmut, which was well known for being a meat grinder. Then what is this? This is so much worse. Even if we say, okay, they doubled the Ukrainian losses, the point stands that they claimed something back then, they're claiming double of that now. Of course, they could lie, but how much more can you lie? You have to keep it at a reasonable rate. If we say that they lie at the same rate through the times, then there is still more than double the casualties than there was back then. And we know from everyone who reported on Bakhmut how devastating that battle was. Then how devastating is this battle? I'm gonna leave it off with that. Thank you all for watching. Hope you all have a great day and see you all next time.